Okay. Today, so many versions of the Bible. Where did they all come from? Well, our story starts with the Emperor Constantine, and I'm sure you all have heard about him. Roman Emperor 306 to 337. But for our purposes, the most important thing about him was the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan, he had a battlefield conversion to Christianity. He saw the sign of the cross. He converted to Christianity. He had all of his troops baptized, whether they wanted to or not. The irony of the story is he had all of his Roman legions be baptized in the river by marching through the river, but holding their swords above their heads so their swords didn't get wet, so they could still go fight. But the Edict of Milan is significant because it ended persecution against Christians. The Edict of Milan did not make Christianity the official religion of the empire. It simply made it legal to be a Christian. There were still other religions being practiced in the empire, but no longer were Christians persecuted. It was no longer illegal to be a Christian. And since the emperor had converted to Christianity and had all his military baptized, obviously there was a great influence of Christianity that continued to spread and spread through it. So he makes it legal to be a Christian. In 331, he commissioned Eusebius, remember that name? We talked about him a few weeks ago? Bishop of Caesarea, to produce 50 copies of the Christian scriptures to be produced and widely distributed. These 50 Bibles are referred to as the 50 Bibles of Constantine. Okay? Now, so that was like the first mass production of the Bible. The Bible is starting to get spread and sent out to Christian churches. Not necessarily individuals, because most people didn't read, but to churches. Now, in our study of where did the Bible come from, there are 4 ancient manuscripts, or codices, and they are called the 4 great unsealed codices. Unsealed simply is the Latin word for capital, because these 4 manuscripts were written in all capitals. No punctuation, no small letters, all capital letters. Now, if you're a texter and you text something in all caps today, it means you're yelling or you're angry. Well, that is not what they meant there. That was a style writing. We're going to look at the 4 great unsealed codices, the oldest manuscripts we have. Ancient biblical manuscripts, Greek capital letters. The original codices contain the entire Old Testament and New Testament. They're the most reliable witnesses to what the original text of the Bible said. Okay? So when Bible scholars go back and say, well, what did the original say? What word was there? In what context? What was it referring to? This is where they like to go. This is the most reliable source. Oh, look at that mood lighting. You understand, when you're in a restaurant and the lights go down, usually the prices go up. The 4 are the Codex Vaticanus, the Codex Sinaiticus, the Codex Alexandrinus, and the Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. The Codex Vaticanus was the first one that we knew existed, and the first one that scholars became aware of. Vaticanus, because it's at the Vatican, and there is no history of where it was before the Vatican. We have no clue. But from the Vatican and through things like carbon dating and handwriting and styles, they determined it was probably written around 340 BC. All right? Contains most of the Old Testament. Remember, it's all in Greek, so the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, not the Masoretic Hebrew text. The Septuagint Old Testament and most of the New Testament, but not the book of Revelation. Now, did it include it originally? Who knows? Is it missing now? Yes, none of it's there. We know it contained most of the Old Testament because there's portions of all the books. but because of deterioration, a lot of pages are ripped in half. There's parts that are illegible. So it doesn't contain all of it, but we know originally it did, because there are parts of it all there, except the book of Revelation. That's not to be seen. It is one of the oldest documents in the Vatican Library, first mentioned by Erasmus of Rotterdam, who lived there in the 15th century. That's how we know it existed way back then, because very few people ever get to go into the Vatican libraries and do research on this stuff. They're well known for keeping their documents very in-house, right? It's opened up a little in the 20th and 21st century, but still there's a lot of stuff in the Vatican that very few people get to see. But Erasmus told us it was there, and so he let the cat out of the bag, and scholars started flocking to the Vatican to try to study this document. Here's one of the interesting things. With this dating, many scholars believe it may be one of those 50 Bibles of Constantine. The dating fits perfectly. So this was the document that the biblical scholars were trying to get their hands on to study, until the Codex Sinaiticus, which we mentioned a couple weeks ago also, remember? It is even older. It goes back slightly older than the Vaticanus to 330. Contains the oldest complete New Testament, and we've got about half of the Septuagint in there. What's helpful is that some of the parts that's missing in the Vaticanus is here in the Sinaiticus, and parts that are missing in Sinaiticus are there. So that's how they can kind of put it together, right? And it includes most of the apocryphal books. I told you the story a couple weeks ago. In 1844, it was discovered at the St. Catherine Monastery, which is at the foot of Mount Sinai, thus the name Sinaiticus, by a biblical scholar, treasure hunter, Constantine van Tischendorf, who sounds like a vampire hunter, doesn't he? I mean, isn't that the guy you'd send to Transylvania? Yeah. And according to Tischendorf, the monks at the monastery gave it to him as a gift for safekeeping so he could take it to the British Museum. The monks at the monastery have spent the last 200 to 300 years trying to get it back. But, once again, because of dating, there's a good possibility this may be one of the 50 Bibles of Constantine. Isn't that cool? That we know by the Roman documents that Constantine ordered this to happen. We know from Eusebius's writing, he tells us he did that work, and we may actually have 2 of those Bibles that were, well, they weren't Bible, they weren't bound like a Bible. You know, these are just loose leaves that are kind of held together. But that we might have 2 of those original 50 Bibles of Constantine. I think that's pretty cool. Yeah.
Where is this now? At the British Museum?
This is mostly at the British Museum. It is actually, there's parts of it, I forget the name, there's parts of it in a Russian museum also. Because Tischendorf was in such a hurry to receive the gift, he didn't get it all. And the Russians came in at some point, and they've got the rest of it. But most of it's at the British Museum.
And he was a British?
No, he was Austrian. He was working, he was a treasure hunter working for the British Museum.
Like a bounty hunter.
He was a bounty hunter working for the Brit, but he was a scholar. I mean, he wasn't just, Dog the bounty hunter, right? I mean, he was a scholar, but he was working on behalf of the British Museum to bring back antiquities. But he didn't get it all. He was in a hurry. All right, so that's 2 of our Uniseal codices. Then we have the Codex Alexandrinus. And the interesting thing, this is the first one we've got that has a little bit of art attached to it. Notice though, it's about 100 years after that last one. But this is the earliest manuscript where someone took some time to fancy it up. Contains most of the Old Testament and most of the New Testament. Interesting about it, it's written in Byzantine style, which was dominant in the Eastern Roman region. All right, the others are obviously from the Western Roman region. So this, the style, the handwriting, all this says it comes from a different part of the Roman Empire. We don't know where it started, other than somewhere in the east, but it was kept in Alexandria, Egypt until 1627, when it was presented as a gift to the King of England. And so this entire thing actually is in the British Museum. And then we have the last one, the Codex Arhy Rescriptus. Now I want you to notice what it looks like over there, okay? That looks very different than what we've seen so far, right? And there's a reason for that. First of all, it contains most of the Old and New Testaments, but it is a palimpsest. It is an original writing document. The original writing was scraped off so the document could be reused. Remember I told you parchment was expensive. People didn't have it. But they found that if they took a blade and they scraped the parchment, like shaving your whiskers, right? Scraped the parchment, they could remove the top layer of parchment with the writing on it. And so they could get a blank sheet. And they did that all the time to documents to be able to reuse the expensive parchment, right? Well, somebody a long time ago scraped the Bible off so they could record the 38 treatises of Ephraim the Syrian, right, okay? Nobody knows who Ephraim the Syrian was. Nobody's heard of this guy. I mean, he doesn't show up anywhere other than in the Ephraim, and that's why it's the Ephraim rewritten, all right? And so we got, but Dog the Bounty Hunter in 1843 used a new process, a chemical wash, to remove the 38 treatises, bringing the original text back to the surface. Wow. Isn't that cool? And say they were able to get back to that original. The downside is the parchment was severely damaged and to this day continues to disintegrate. So they are racing like the wind to get this sucker digitalized and recorded, because they know it's not going to last very long, because the same process that brought it to light is destroying it. So we're not going to have this document for another 100 years. It's going away. But with our ability to photograph and digitalize things these days, there's the chance that we can still have access to all this. So those are the four great ancient manuscripts that people go back to, and scholars spend time, well, what is this word? And language changes, and our understanding of language changes. Because remember, we have other documents from this time period that are not biblical, not religious. And they compare words from those documents to these and say, well, we used to think this word was this, but it's more of a nuance that, or in this context, it's obviously that, not this, so they compare all these documents. So these are four very precious. What's left of this is in the Louvre in Paris. The French got that one. Okay, now, as interesting as all that is for scholarly work, this is it, right? But for influence in the church and in the world, nothing tops the influence of the Latin Vulgate. Now we're back at 382. It was primarily written by St. Jerome, contains the Old Testament and New Testament. There are times where it's clear the handwriting changed a little bit. So they think that maybe he had some of his disciples or scribes, clean things up or whatnot. But it's clear that he did 90% of the work. It was the Bible for thousands of years. First to translate the Old Testament from Hebrew into Latin. Another big thing is, remember, all those others were written in Greek, right? So he's translating into Latin. Why were the others written in Greek? Because at the time, that was the common language of the land. Greek's going by the wayside, and now scholars and people, priests and all, are using Latin. So he's changing everything to Latin. New Testament's being translated from a variety of earlier manuscripts that were written in both Greek and in Latin. By the 13th century, it was the most commonly used version. And in 1545, the Council of Trent declared it to be the official version of the Roman Catholic Church. This was the Bible. For the majority of Christians who have ever lived on the face of the earth throughout history, this would have been their Bible. We cannot underestimate the impact the Vulgate had, not just on the church and on Christianity, but in the world in general. So, and good old St. Jerome. St. Jerome is the patron saint of biblical scholars, translators, archaeologists, and librarians. Yay, St. Jerome. All right, so that is the early Bible. Through what we call the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, whatever you want to call it, there were no significant changes, improvements, revisions. There were a few updates, obviously, they know by studying the manuscripts to the Vulgate, but nothing consequential or serious was going on. People were happy with the Vulgate. Remember, we have not yet gotten to the Enlightenment and to the idea of critical research. Things like this are yet to come. So nothing's happening. The next big advancement is, and I'm going to say, there's just too much material to do it all, so I'm limiting to this to the English Bible, or the Bible in the English language, okay? Because the Germans are doing their thing, and you know, we've got, this is being translated in all these different languages, and they've got their own history. It would take a whole semester just to do all the different ones. So we got the early ones, now we're gonna skip to just those in the English language, how we got our Bibles, okay? Fair enough? Just can't do it all in one Sunday. Then from the Vulgate of 385, we're almost 1,000 years later, the next big significant improvement comes with a guy named John Wycliffe, 1328 to 1384. He translated the Vulgate into English. All right, so by this time, fewer and fewer people, the priests are still learning Latin, but that's about it. You know, it's priests and a few scholars. Most of your clergy, your pastors, priests, you know, well, the priests would know it. Pastors of churches may not know it. And so he translates the whole thing into English. He was an Oxford University professor, a dissident within the Roman Catholic Church. He is often called the morning star of the Protestant Reformation. When you study the Protestant Reformation, his is usually the first name that comes up. We started our story of the Bible with Constantine. The story of the Protestant Reformation starts with John Wycliffe. Hey, Stacy, I'm guessing that clock's wrong back there.
It is wrong.
Okay.
You need to be watching the time.
I need to be watching the time. Anybody got a sundial? So he was convicted of 260 charges of heresy by the Council of Constance because he was such a dissident and they did not approve his translating the Vulgate into English. Bless his heart, he died of a stroke before they could burn him at the stake. Yeah.
Mercy.
Thanks be to God. The next big thing, 200 years later, we have the Tindale Bible. Maybe some of you have heard the Tindale Bible. William Tindale, 1494 to 1536, first English translation of the Bible that went back and worked directly from the Hebrew and the Greek. Remember, Wycliffe translated the Vulgate, did not go back to the Hebrew and Greek, just translated the Vulgate. He goes back to the Hebrew and the Greek texts. This is a huge advancement in scholarship, huge. He is the beginning of modern biblical scholarship, right here, Tindale. His work obviously leans heavily upon Jerome's Latin Vulgate and Martin Luther's New Testament, which was in German, which was published just a few years ahead. The way he uses certain phrasing and whatnot, it's obviously he chose that phrasing, you know, because there was something distinctive about that from the Vulgate or from Martin Luther. So William Tindale, First English Bible that was mass-produced by the printing press. Okay? So his Bible is getting around. He was declared a heretic in 1536. Strangled to death, body cremated by civil authorities for disturbing the peace.
And cremation was meant to...
That kept you out of heaven.
Yeah, it kept you out of heaven back then.
Yeah.
Also, they couldn't... You had no grave for them to worship.
But you see, it's kind of like, remember Jesus with Pilate and Herod and all this? See, the civil authorities couldn't put you to death for being a heretic. That was a religious issue. But they could put you to death for disturbing the peace. Right? So the next up comes the Great Bible, authorized by King Henry VIII. He ordered a copy to be secured by chain. Were people stealing the Bibles? Maybe because they didn't have a lot of paper and parchment stuff, right? Secured by chain to the pulpit of every Anglican church and read from aloud during all services of worship. And so to do that, they had to create their new Bible. Produced by a guy named Miles Coverdale, and it is not uncommon to hear this referred to as a Coverdale Bible. In fact, in England, if you go to an Anglican church, an Anglican seminary, they don't call it the Great Bible, they call it the Coverdale Bible. And it was under the supervision of Thomas Cromwell, who many of you I'm sure have heard of. Here's the thing. He did not use the original Greek and Hebrew sources. He just went back to the Tindale. Okay? Now, Tindale had used the original Greek and Hebrew, and he was like, good enough for me. And so he used the Tindale, except in those areas which the Anglican clergy found objectionable. Okay? Because we still live in the real world. But this is 1539, Henry VIII. Then Geneva Bible comes along. It was published in Switzerland, 1557, got to England by 1576. Written by Protestant English scholars exiled in Switzerland during the reign of the Roman Catholic Queen Mary in England. Remember? Henry VIII made him Protestant. Queen Mary brought him back to Catholicism. And then Elizabeth brought him back to Protestantism. Remember that whole back and forth stuff, right? Well, for a brief time, they became Catholic again. So all these English scholars and clergy went off to Switzerland to battle. And they wrote the Geneva Bible, translated from the original Greek and Hebrew, considered Calvinistic. Remember, Switzerland is where Calvin's preaching these days, right? Considered Calvinistic because of the notes published in the margin. It's the world's first study Bible. Calvin wrote an entire commentary on every book of the Bible except the book of Revelation, which he didn't think should be in the Bible. He wrote a commentary on each one, and in the Geneva Bible, they put all his Calvin's notes in the Bible. It was the first study Bible. But the Anglicans did not like that. Very popular with Protestants, especially Puritans, distrusted by most conservative clergymen, never officially approved by any church or council, but it became, in its moment in time, the most read Bible amongst Protestants. Okay? We cannot underestimate the influence of the Geneva Bible for the Protestants, and it set this whole tradition of study Bibles. So this is 1557, then 1576. Then the Bishop's Bible, 1568, officially authorized by the Church of England to succeed the Great Bible that Henry VIII had put forward, led by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Matthew Parker. Anglican scholars sought to produce a popular alternative to the Geneva Bible. Those Calvinists, we're going to have our own, right? Primarily translated from the original Hebrew and Greek, not completely. Matthew Parker did not assign a senior editor to oversee the project, so there are a lot of inconsistencies in translation from book to book, because some translators are better than others, and some have their own personal preferences on how they phrase things. Remember, translation is an art, not a science. So each one has and there was no one to pull it all together, which makes it an awkward thing to read. So what happened? People kept reading the Geneva Bible. The Bishop's Bible became the basis for the popular King James Version. Maybe some of you have heard of King James, right? So this is why the Geneva Bible, okay? So the Protestants go to Geneva in exile, and they write their Bible with all these Calvinistic notes. The Anglicans in England come back, well, we'll make one even better, but it wasn't. The Bishop's Bible, but this became the basis for King. That's the only reason we care about the Bishop's Bible. It was what they used as the main reference to make the King James. King James, first published in 1611, then a major revision in 1789. In 1604, young King James I of England ordered a new version of the Bible to be printed in English because existing translations, talking about the Bishop's Bible, but mainly he was talking about the Great Bible, the Cloverdale Bible of Henry VIII. The existing translations were corrupt and not answerable to the truth of the original. I do not believe that's an exact quote from James I. Sounds like maybe, his PR staff got together and crafted this. I doubt he was that much of a biblical scholar. But 47 English scholars working in 6 teams, working separately at Oxford, Westminster, and Cambridge universities. Now, this is funny. Earliest printed versions that came out, which we still have copies of, were filled with editorial oversight errors. For example, the omission of the word "not" in the commandment forbidding adultery. We have copies, several copies of these Bibles, and it is sometimes referred to as the wicked version. Once again, scholarship and printing was laborious. It was time consuming. I'm sure people fell asleep. Mistakes happen, okay? So to clarify today in this class, it is do not commit adultery. Right? But this, King James, became the most later editions, not the first printing, became widely read Bible in the English language until the middle of the 20th. This took over for the Vulgate, okay? You had the Vulgate from the 4th century until the King James. The influence of the Vulgate, crazy. And then you've got the King James. It's crazy that any one version was so popular, so well read, and influenced so many people. We still go back and study the King James. The other thing I want to point out is this was the largest translation project since the Septuagint.
Yes.
Remember how we talked about the Septuagint translating into the whole Bible into Greek, right? So that's in the 1st century. This is the biggest translation project since the 1st century. The production of the King James was huge. It was not without error. It was not perfect, but this was a major advancement in biblical scholarship. And even though we rarely use the King James anymore, like the Vulgate, we should have deep appreciation for the King James and the way it transmitted and brought forth the scriptures to common people as well as the educated people, and the way it advanced scholarship within the parameters of what scholarship was in those days. Yeah.
Do you know a book, and I believe its name is God's Bestseller?
God's Secretaries.
What?
It's a book, God's Secretaries, about the writing of the King James
Yeah,
Version. It's in
okay.
the church library.
Okay.
Oh, fun.
It was God's Bestseller,
Yeah.
okay.
I know of the book, but I have not read it.
All right, it's a good book.
It's
Yeah.
a good book.
Some of you probably have King James, because I know when I was a kid,
Look at the
my
demographics in this room.
yeah, I know. That's what I'm
This
saying.
is our Bible.
Did any of you grow up with the wicked version? No. No. I mean, we had a King James. It was the family Bible, and people don't do this much anymore. But that's where we kept the genealogy, right? And we had in there my grandparents' birth certificates and death certificates. It's like where you kept all your genealogy. we hardly ever read from it. It was like the library, it was where we kept the important documents, but we read from a different one, you know? Anyways, thank God for the King James. Then, about 10 years later, the English Revised Version is commissioned in 1870 to adapt the King James Version, which was originally from 1611. So we're talking about,
200 years.
200 plus years. To adapt the King James Version to the present state of the English language without changing the idiom and vocabulary, and to adapt it to the present standard of biblical scholarship. To change it to the present state of the language. This is one of those things that is an ongoing challenge, and it's also job security for translators, because the English language changes. What words used to mean is not necessarily what they mean today. The perfect example is it used to be when you called someone gay, it meant they were happy. I feel pretty, right?
Yeah.
Today it means a homosexual orientation. So the language changes. And so our Bible versions change. Unfortunately, human beings like things the way they are. And so almost every time there is an advancement in scholarship, there's an equal reaction against whatever that advancement might. And it doesn't matter what the advancement is. If it's science, engineering, whatever, there's always those opposed to it because it's new. And that's human beings. The English Revised Version were permitted only if they rendered a translation more accurate and faithful to the original text. This is important, regardless of theological persuasions. Remember how we had in the previous version that they could make any changes they wanted as long as it was okay with the Anglican clergy. They wanted to make sure the Anglican theology stayed in. For the first time ever, we have a Bible that's being produced regardless of theological persuasion. Okay? That's another huge step in biblical scholarship. Suddenly, with this version, the scholars are in charge, not the church. Okay? It's not the bishops telling the scholars what to do. It's the scholars saying, we're going to do this to the best of our ability using the tools we got. You can figure out the theology later. That was a huge, huge step. English Revised Version. Only the most reliable Hebrew and Greek manuscripts were used. By now, with the antiquity collections, we've got a lot more ancient manuscripts. None as complete as those first four we looked at, but we've got scraps of all sorts of stuff coming in. And they are going through figuring out which ones are reliable and accurate, and this was a huge endeavor. 50 English scholars of various theological traditions, a handful of Americans were invited to contribute through correspondence. So there's like a tip of the hat. These were probably your biblical scholars from Harvard and Yale and Princeton, those old Ivy Leagues that all had biblical studies department. You know who's got one of the best biblical studies library in the world? University of Texas. University of Texas has they don't have a seminary, they have a biblical studies department, and they have one of the best ancient rare book libraries of any university in the world, right there. Yeah. They got a Gutenberg Bible. Yeah.
Wow. Oh yeah, I saw that.
These folks found over 30,000 changes from the King James Version in the New Testament alone. And the difference here is now the scholars, without any theological concerns, are looking at the text in a scholarly manner rather than being told, well, you can't touch that and you can't touch that. English. Why is it important? Because the English Bible becomes the American Standard Bible in 1901. The only changes made there are certain American idioms that are different from British idioms that even then was recognized. And so there were a few changes in the wording given how the language is different. If you go to England today, there are a few things, we can understand each other, but they say things differently than we say things. But this became the American Standard Version of 1901. That leads to the Revised Standard Version All right, so I'm going to tell you this. From the Vulgate to the King James to the Revised Standard Version, those were the three biggest Bibles in history in terms of biblical scholarship. The Revised Standard Version of 52. Remember, World War II is over. The UN started in 1950, I think it was. There was this sense of international cooperation. There was a sense of American coming together. We were building organizations. We were building corporations. We were, it was like anything could happen. And there was a sense of we can do this together in the 1950s. This revision of the American Standard was published by the brand new National Council of Churches. 50 ecumenical scholars, including Protestant, Catholic, and Jews, came together to work on this. Aimed to present a literally accurate translation in modern English without the bias of any specific theological tradition. The scholars are taking over the text. First Bible translators to ever get their hands on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, it was new, and a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls were not open to the public. Very few scholars were, but this group got to work with the earliest batch of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They also dropped the eth ending of verbs like walketh and prayeth. And they got rid of the these and thous of the King James and went to you and your. Okay? People hated it.
They did. Especially the 23rd Psalm.
Oh, the 23rd Psalm. Well, we're going to get to that when we get to the. But anyway, the people hated it. And so today, there are times, like at funerals in particular, people ask, will you read it from the King James? We like the these and the thous. And isn't that amazing? But scholars say that's not how we talk. So we can add the these and the thous, we can add the walkeths if we want. But they got rid of all that to make it a more contemporary. It was the first truly ecumenical Bible widely used by both Protestants and Catholics. Now, there were two versions. There was the Protestant one without the Apocrypha, and there was the Catholic one with the Apocrypha. But the corpus of the New Testament and Old Testament were exactly the same. First time ever. This was huge. 15 years later, the Jerusalem Bible comes in. In 43, Pope Pius XII called for a new version of the Bible translated directly from the Hebrew and Greek instead of from Jerome's Vulgate. Because all the Catholic Bibles were just looking at Jerome saying, no, he knew what he was doing. And now he says, no. He's seen what all these other Protestant scholars are doing. And he says, we got to have an official Catholic version with that level of scholarship. So he commissions the New Jerusalem. First version was published in French in 1956 because the Catholic Church is international. So the French scholars got on it. The English version, 10 years later, was a translation of the French. Don't know why. My theory is they were working on the RSV, but so they didn't have time for all that. But from the French. To this day, the Jerusalem Bible is widely used for Mass in the Roman Catholic Church. And there have been future additions, changes, along the way. But if you go to a Catholic church, this is what they use. Along comes the New International Version, the NIV. First published in 78, and then a major revision in 2011. In 67, the New York Bible Society, now called Biblica, hired 15 evangelical scholars and tasked them with producing an English Bible that was easily understood and consistent with evangelical theology. What do you notice that's different? Only evangelical scholars, 15 hand-selected, only evangelical scholars, and it was to be consistent with evangelical theology. It's a total step away from the RSV, which is tell us what it means without concern for the theology. We'll work out the theology. Okay? Translation was from the original Hebrew and Greek. It became, and I believe still is, the best-selling version of the Bible in the United States. In 2011, an inclusive language revision was published. And people hate it.
Why is it, do you believe, the best-selling version?
Because conservative evangelical Christians buy more Bibles than mainline Protestants. Yeah. If you go to a non-denom, a Baptist, any of these churches, everyone carries their Bible to church. It's part of the piety culture. The piety culture of a mainline Protestant is we assume the Bibles will be there. We don't have to bring ours, right? So evangelical Christians buy more Bibles than mainline Protestants.
So this was a reaction to the RSC?
I would say so. I think this was a reaction from the ecumenical movement saying we're going to do our own thing. We're not going to be a part of what y'all are doing. We're going to separate off and do our own thing. Then along comes the new Revised Standard Version, which was published in 1989 and a major update, once again, 2011. Or no, I think that's 21. That should be 2021.
That's
because it
21,
just
yes.
happened. This also was published by the National Council of Churches. 30 scholars from Protestant, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and Jewish traditions. The earlier Bibles didn't include the Orthodox. Now in the revision, we included Orthodox scholars as well. They're trying to get as many different scholars of as many different faith traditions together on this. They're trying to come up with a Bible that can be trusted, accurately used, regardless of your denominational flavor. Their motto was, as literal as possible, as free as necessary. Recognizing that you wanted to say, the words of the Old Testament, but language changes. So what do you have to do to make it mean? The word for word versus, if we did a word for word, it wouldn't mean anything to us. What does it mean given the language today? All right, literal as possible, free as necessary. First version to commit to examining and erasing translator bias. Human was no longer translated as mankind. All the people was used instead of men, where the context made it clear that women were present. These are the first folks to really take seriously that in Hebrew, there is a word for man, there is a word for humanity, there's a word for woman. All through history, when the Hebrew word for humanity was found, it was translated men or mankind. Every single time. Not because they were intentionally doing that, it was the bias of the translators. When you live in a male-dominated patriarchy, the theory was men referred to everybody. Until the women started to speak up and say, hey guys, no it doesn't. All right? And this was the first group to seriously take the blinders of male patriarchy off and see how it had affected the translators and the scholarship of all these generations beforehand. So they didn't make stuff up. They were accused of just making stuff up to be politically correct. No. They went back and said, if it says human in Hebrew, we're not going to write men or mankind. And if Jesus is talking to a group where it's very clear there were women, in the context of the story, there are women present, we're not going to say he was speaking to the men. He was speaking to all the people. All right? Taking off those blinders of white patriarchy. And people hated it. Most commonly used version in all of higher education. Most seminaries, most graduate schools. This is the version that you are using today in most. Now, there are schools and seminaries that have a particular theological persuasion, like Dallas Theological Seminary, where they want nothing to do with this. They have their own Scofield Bible that they like to use, and only they use it. But not everyone. Those that are more intent to present a political, theological agenda don't use it. But mainline schools, University of Texas, Austin Seminary, Duke, Davidson, Fuller Seminary, they're all using this. The Society of Biblical Literature, interesting, not the National Council of Churches. See the shift? In 2021, the Society of Biblical Literature initiated a revision for incorporating advances in textual scholarship since 1989. This, the updated version of 21, is the one we happen to use here in this church. Now, you're not required to use it. You can use any Bible that you want in this church. There is no, for instance, you go to a non-denom Bible church, let's talk about places like the Ridge, they're going to push you to a Scofield Bible. We say this is what we use, but you can read whatever Bible you want. Okay?
Al, can you give an example of textual scholarship? Go back one slide.
Well, textual scholarship would be various things. For instance, we are still discovering new documents. Believe it or not, the late 40s, they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. Scholars still haven't worked through all that. Still haven't got it all. There was so much material. So, and the biggest changes that I'm aware of from the 21 happened in the book of Isaiah, where what we're finding in the Dead Sea Scrolls is completely making them rethink a lot of the book of Isaiah.
In other words, finding an older version of the same text with clearer language might mean that your translation would have to change.
The Library of Nag Hammadi has come online since then. I mean, there's more ancient texts available. And so they're going back at these and saying, oh, we always had it this way, but the more appropriate word seems to have been this. Does that make sense?
Now, would you go back and cover the non-denominational Bible?
I tell you, I got one more slide, and then we're going to open it up for questions, okay? The other one I want to talk about is the Common English Bible, or the CEB, published in 2011. 120 scholars from a variety of Protestant denominations, translated from the original Hebrew and Greek. But this is fascinating. The emphasis is on the meaning of the passage rather than the accuracy of the original wording. Okay? So, there is in translation a scale. And it's called functional versus formal. And in the formal side are your transliterations, where things are translated word for word. We talk about transliterations, right? Absolute word for word. On the that's the formal side. On the functional side is your paraphrases, right? We're not trying to get a word for word. We're just worried about the meaning, right? Most Bibles are somewhere in the middle. Some, like the NRSV, lean closer to the formal, and so it's a little awkward. Some, like the NIV, lean towards the functional, so it's a little less accurate, but the meaning comes across, all right? So this is a big selling Bible where they literally said, we are the first one to just come out and say, we're going to lean this way to make sure people understand it. But it was never intended for serious Bible study. It was intended for public reading and personal devotion, so that you got the meaning of what was being said. If you really want to do a Bible study, you're not going to use this or the NIV or the Jerusalem. You'd want the New Revised Standard, because it leans towards the formal side. Yeah, Mike?
One of those scholars was Eddie Newman.
On the NRSV?
No.
CEB.
On the CEB? Okay. Okay. Cool.
You have about 5 minutes.
Well, you have about 5 minutes. Okay. Questions?
The formal side, how about the New American Standard Bible?
The New American.
NASB.
Yeah.
Is that more the formal side of things rather than the...
I would put the NASB right down the middle. Yeah, I think it's less formal than the NRSV, but it's more formal than the NIV or the CEB. Yeah, I would. But that's my opinion.
And now the Scofield Bibles, are they used for more of a study reference, or what's the point of a non-denominational church pushing that particular Bible?
So Scofield, the guy who translated that Bible, was a professor of, I think it was Old Testament, at Princeton Theological Seminary, was kicked out because of his heresies, left, wrote the Scofield Bible, came to Dallas and formed Dallas Theological Seminary. He invented the theology called predispensationalists. It is very strict, literal word-for-word interpretation. So that means in the book of Genesis, we have 2 accounts of creation, right? Dallas Theological, the Scofield Bible, teaches that the world was created twice. It's not 2 versions of one event. There were 2 events. Everything is taken absolutely literally. And to do that, you have to spin all these non-biblical stories to make it all fit your time reference and your understanding. So it's an ultra-literal Bible. And the whole idea is that the predispensationalists, the history of the world is divided into dispensations or eras, and God has changed in each one of those eras. That the God of the Old Testament is not the God of the New Testament. And the God of the New Testament is not the God of the book of Acts and the works of the apostles. And, I mean, you have to spin all this stuff. It's unbelievably popular with fundamentalists. This church used to employ people from that seminary.
Yep.
There was a period of time. When I came here, 3 people on staff here were graduates of Dallas Theological Seminary.
I remember the Good News for Modern Man.
Yeah, Good News for Modern Man was great. It was a paraphrase. They didn't even try to be, they were not translation. They were clear, we're not translation. We're just taking it and putting it into the vernacular. Yeah. And there's a lot, there's so many different versions out there.
Can we put the Bibles back in the pews?
Is it possible? I think you could do it.
That would be good. I always like to read.
Are they going to do it? Well, I think the concern is if you're just sitting there reading the Bible, you won't pay attention to the worship
They took them out
service.
for COVID.
I know why they took them out, but they found out that people paid attention when they didn't have Bibles.
Let me do a little update on that. When we took the Bibles out for COVID, those were NIV Bibles, y'all.
Oh.
Y'all may not know that, but those were NIV Bibles that had been here for 15, 20 years. So during COVID, they were given away. I mean, we don't have them to put back in. They were given away. So discussions are underway right now about purchasing Bibles and putting them in the sanctuary.
Could we chain one to the pulpit?
We could chain one to the pulpit. But there have been a couple of issues. Some people have raised the issue of that's a lot of money, and could that money be better spent feeding the poor?
Since everyone's got a Bible on their phone.
Since everyone has Bibles on their phone. So that's been one issue. The other issue is, and this is really embarrassing, but remember that NRSVUE is only 3 years old.
The updated version.
The updated version. It's only 3 years old. That's the Bible that your pastors would prefer because we use that on the screens. It's so new that they haven't come up with a cheap enough version yet. Because what happens is when something's newly published, the publishers don't have a lot of options yet, and they're still like $30 a piece. That we're working. We have a donor who would like to fund it. We're working to get a good copy, and the publishers are telling us that there are going to be some new options coming out in the next year or so. So I think you're going to see it happen. But the reason it's taken a while, there have been multiple issues that we've been dealing with. It isn't that we don't love the Bible, okay? That's not why.
So here's why I want Bibles in the pews. Because we actually did a safety training way back in the day. If we were to have an armed intruder enter the sanctuary, the idea is everyone was instructed, you throw the Bible or hymnal, and the person would be distracted. That would allow someone else on our safety yard to take the person down. So we were all instructed, if there's an armed
That's just
intruder,
awful.
you take it and throw the Bible at them, right? Now we got our friendship pads. I don't think that's gonna, I don't know if that's gonna do much.
I was